All right, there we go. We are now live. All right. I'm going to be going back to my didactic historical analysis of American history, talking about the United States. This is going to be the fault lines in U.S. American History Case Study 3, The Influences of Unwavering Protestantism. Fudge! Gang! I am still a hard man! Let's go! All right, so every culture has something in common. Every culture that is made by man, that is man-made, always has a common juncture. Even though it may seem that different cultures have different nuances to them, they all have one thing in common. They all have a set of common tribal customs. Every culture, every tribe has a common custom, a common language, a common spoken language and custom, and the like. In a higher civilization or a higher civilized culture, it's usually religion. From about the Middle Ages onwards, religion has been a very important central focus in the West. Now, in Western culture, unlike in other cultures, there isn't a direct perspective into the divine. There's a separation in the West between the secular and the divine, and there is a lack of communal engagement in the worship of God in the West. There is a lack of community-centered worship. But there are these dissident religious groups in the West, dissident religious groups who tend to be outcasts from the mainstream, but who engage in like these spiritualistic practices and stuff, and sometimes they're called evangelicals, sometimes they're pragmatists, sometimes they're referred to as Protestant independents. There's a lot of that. So, in American history, in early colonial American history, and even today, the common theme has always been Protestant, unwavering, unfaltering Protestant faith or faith engagement or whatever. But the history of the United States is a history of Protestantism. It's a history of something that actually did not even begin in the United States. Not even in the 13 colonies. It began in Western Europe. It actually started in Western Europe, and it spread into the colonies through the Protestant colonizers, and it took on a Native American trend. If you go to the Netherlands, if you go to England, or if you go to Germany or Scandinavia, you're going to find a Protestantism that is actually very different from the kind of Protestantism in America. You're going to find a very different type of Christianity in Europe from what you find in America. because native homegrown American Christianity has, since the founding of the colonies, has already taken on its own distinctly American traits. This is something that other religions that came into the United States did over the course of multiple generations. They took on a more distinctly American vibe. This happened to Catholics. This happened to American Catholics, American Orthodox, American pagans, and even American Muslims and American Buddhists and American Jews. They all adapted and assimilated into the American way of life, and they appropriated that into their religion. And what actually ended up happening is they became more closer to the Protestant groups. These different religions actually became more closer to American Protestant groups than they do with their own co-religionists back overseas. There are exceptions, okay? I'm not saying that they became Protestant. I'm saying that they adapted and assimilated over time to the American way of life, which is from Protestantism. So there is no doubt whatsoever that the United States was very much influenced by and directly taken under the wing of the Protestant Reformation and of the more visceral and radical elements of that Reformation, which was actually rejected by a lot of the Europeans. American Calvinism is far more Calvinistic than anything that John Calvin or John Knox could have ever envisioned. American Lutheranism is far more what it is than anything that Martin Luther would have ever conceived of. American Anglicanism, Episcopalianism, far more than Henry VIII or Thomas Cranmer could have envisioned. It is a fundamentalistic and very strongly faith-centered community that you don't really see in Europe. In Europe, the trust is on the institutions and what the institutions have to say. In America, it is far more personal and far more confronting and more direct and discreet compared to Protestantism in Europe. So that's a significant difference too. Another thing as well about American religiosity, there was never a mainline standard church in America. There had never been a national church in the United States that basically controlled everything. Not even in the colonial era. Okay? And that is what really makes the United States so distinct. That's what makes the United States so much like of what it is. There is no national church. None of the 50 states have a state-run church. None of the United States, nowhere will you find a national church. There are going to be at least 5 different denominations, usually Protestant. Sometimes there might be something else, but in every area, in every state or region, there is always at least 5 or more denominations. That is really unique. At the time of the founding of the country, there was like some 10,000 different denominations. And that had a very direct imprint on the way that the founding documents were set up. So from the get-go, from the very beginning, from the from the insinuation of all of it, America was a very highly religious society. There is no national church. There is no state-centered church. There is many different denominations. There is this sense of direct and personal spiritual awakening that came out of the Great Awakening eras. Jonathan Edwards and John Wesley and the like. And it had a tremendously huge impact on how this country was shaped. The other major impact was the Western frontier, and the impact of being a frontier settler society. People coming from somewhere else and settling and conquering the land and stuff, and all of that mythology that basically became quite standardized into mainstream American folklore. So, about 100 years before the founding of Jamestown, you have this thing called the Protestant Reformation. It breaks out first in Central Europe, and it spreads into Northern and Western Europe. And you have these different groups. You have Lutherans, Calvinists, Presbyterians, Anglicans, or Episcopalians. And then later you have Methodists and Baptists. You have Amish and Quakers, the Shakers, and all of that stuff. You have tons and tons and tons of all these different denominations. And when they come to Massachusetts Bay Colony, they are competing. Colonial America was a religious hotbed of Protestant competition, as well as mercantile competition. The competition of trade and transaction and commerce and the competition in religion was all the rage. There was no bounds whatsoever. Whatever type of limitations in terms of like worship and engagement in Europe that the Protestants in Europe were doing, none of that was in America. And if it was transplanted into America, it was very soon undone. It was very soon, very quickly discarded, because a community, a rival religious or an offshoot religious community, they could always break away and go west. They could always settle further out west and found their own settlements and incorporate their own towns and counties, and they could break away and have their own religion. There was no limitations. This is Protestantism, Protestant free thinking without bounds. This is Protestantism, or what I refer to as Protestantism without bounds. And there's talk and there is discussion about how there is discussions and talks of how Calvinism had a tremendous influence on early America, how Presbyterianism had an influence, or no, it was Anglicanism. They all had a influence in their own right. All of these different Protestant groups in the colony that they were in, or in the colony that they settled, at the time that they settled, in the historical circumstances and situations that they settled, all had a big impact on shaping the society around them. So South Carolina was a very Episcopalian colony. Massachusetts was a very Unitarian state colony. Massachusetts was very heavily Unitarian. South Carolina was Anglican or Episcopalian. You have these just incredibly separate and distinct Protestant sects and groups. They are developing and they are engaging in open discussions. They are engaging in open debates in regards to worship, in regards to the Bible, to the catechisms, to the confessions of faith that they have, to the influence of their preachers or their ministers or pastors. And they are openly engaging in this tremendously hot debate between groups and stuff. For example, in the 19th century, the Presbyterians broke up. Presbyterians broke up between traditionalists and reformers. The Lutherans broke up into the Missouri Synod, the Missouri Synod, and these other groups. The Quakers branched off into preservationist Quakers, reformist Quakers, all of these different major religious groups. The Baptists and the Methodists are a good example. Before the Civil War, the Methodists broke up over the issues of slavery into Methodist North and South. The Methodists broke up into different groups. The Baptists have, ever since their beginning, have broken up into local branches. Some of them are more Bible-centered. Others are kind of more folk community-centered or community-centered. From the beginning of American history all the way down to the present, there have been these Protestant movements and reawakening Protestant movements that have broken off. They've taken shape, or they dissolved, or they were absorbed into another sect. And this is a common theme. This is a very common trend in American history, is this influence of religion. So in the 1600s, you just simply had the sects that had already formed in Europe that came over and settled in the colonies. You had Quakers, Dutch Reformed, Calvinists, you had Anglicans or Episcopalians, and Lutherans, and Roman Catholics, and really just that. It was just whatever had already been established in Europe came over to the colonies, and there wasn't necessarily a lot of debranching and rebranching and all of that. You get up into the late 1700s, and already it is much more complicated. You have the first Great Awakening. There are these things I heard about how in the early 1700s that people were losing their faith. People were going to the Enlightenment. Like people were going over to the Enlightenment, embracing humanism, rationalism, and embracing a kind of secular worldview. They didn't necessarily say that they weren't Christians, but they did, they moved away from it. What I think that this is, I think that this is the beginning of the breakup of the transplanted European institutions, or the transplanted European religious institutions that had been brought over into the early colonies. I think that by around 1700, 1690, 1700, 1710, I think that these institutions were breaking apart. The Glorious Revolution in 1688 had an influence as well on this. The French and Indian Wars had another influence, but I think that the first Great Awakening was the beginning of American evangelicalism as we know it today, a reorientation to more of the Bible and faith and personal conviction, personal assurance and awakening, and all of that. You have the Puritan Jonathan Edwards. You have the Methodist John Wesley, who was a Calvinist. He was an early John Wesley, the Scottish American, was he was an Arminianist. I apologize. He was an Arminianist. And he represented a kind of Wesleyan Arminianism, kind of a Wesleyan Arminianism in the 1740s, 1750s. So what you see with the First Great Awakening is the failure of the transplanted Western European religious institutions and churches and their replacement with more native institutions. You have Native American voices or colonial American voices that have come of age and are beginning to preach the Word of God. They're preaching the Bible, they're preaching in the church, they're preaching at the pulpit, and they are actively engaging with a more American crowd and a more American movement. 20 or 30 years later, you get to the American Revolution, and all of the founding fathers are very influenced by this. I have a friend of mine on Discord, and he was talking to me about how he believes in whatever the founding fathers believed, and I told him that he was wrong. I straight up told him, you're wrong, dude. You don't understand the complexities and the nuances of the circumstances of the time of the 18th century. You're not understanding what these men were writing. You're not understanding, you're not reading the letters, you're not reading the correspondence, and you're not reading the sermons and ministries and sermons that these people wrote in the time period. So you're clearly, you don't know what you're saying. You very clearly have no idea at all about what the founding fathers thought in terms of religion. It is not that simple. You cannot have a King James Bible. You cannot have a King James Bible and just read through it and just simply very foolishly assume that that's what Thomas Jefferson thought. No, that's not how it works. There was other things that they were reading besides that. There was other things going on too. So the poor farmers, the Farmer's Almanac, sometimes the King James Bible, sometimes the Geneva Bible, sometimes even other types of Bibles were used and read in places like Boston, in places like Williamsburg, in Boston, in Philadelphia, in Williamsburg, in Charleston, places like that, in Raleigh, North Carolina, perhaps, maybe New York. New York was still very Dutch. Actually, New York was very culturally Dutch, very deep into the 18th century, but you get my point. Most people in the 17th and 18th century were farmers. Most people that lived in the 17th, 18th, and early 19th, and even late 19th centuries were farmers and engaged in agriculture. And the wealthiest farmers, the wealthiest ranchers, the wealthiest agriculturalists were the elites of society. They tended to go to dance halls. They engaged in valet and in various types of dance halls and various types of banquets and fun and the like. Or they went to taverns. People went to taverns to talk and to chat, or to engage in chatting and interaction in taverns and dance halls and meeting halls or meeting houses and coffee houses and hot chocolate houses. Yes, there was hot chocolate houses, or engaged in shipyards and the like. The most important aspect of colonial life was trade and commerce, especially at the ports and on the ships, on the decks of ships and at the ports. on the eastern seaboard, people actively engaged in trade and in commerce, and there was issues around piracy and dealing with piracy and the French. French buccaneers or Spanish or even renegade English buccaneers would try to capture ships and interrupt the trade routes and stuff, but most of the engagement in the colonies was based on commerce by shipping, navy or naval activity, sea trading, and fishing and farming. That was the mainstay of the colonies. And that influenced their religious devotions. It influenced their religious thinking or line of thinking at the time. The American colonies were very religious. They were very religiously committed, very Christian committed. There is a much higher aptitude or a much more higher aptitude of religious institutional engagement than now. The church and the religion was much more strongly felt in the hearts and minds of the community, and the church was much more engaging in secular life then compared to now. That being said, the religious influences of the founding fathers was directly brought over by the Puritans. The Puritans were moralists. They were moral supremacists. They were very avid and hard workers and very avid readers of the Bible and the catechisms and confessions of faith, statements of faith, and the reformers and the founders of their religious sects. Very well read. You had ordained ministers and ordained bishops and rectors of the faith, and they would go to England. The wealthiest of them, or the most wealthiest of them, would go to England to study at Oxford and to study in Cambridge. They would study in England or in Great Britain to get their masters in theology, their masters in philosophy, and they would come back and they would become rectors of the faith, or they would become professors of theology or philosophy, or professors of the classics. Later on, in the late 1700s, there was a more active engagement in studying the classics. One of the most profound books, or profound set of novels that came out in 1776 was Edward Gibbon's The Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. And there was lots of discussions, there was lots of active engaging discussions and talks in meeting houses and taverns about the Roman Empire and the Greek city-states or the Greek polises. The colonists would talk about how each of their colonies was like a Greek polis or a city-state unto itself, and how the colonies needed to form into like the Achaean League or the Delian League. They would talk about how their politics was like that of the Romans. The Continental Congress would quite often compare themselves to the Senate of the Roman Republic, the Roman Republican Senate, and how their foundations was like that of Rome. How the foundations of what they were doing, the experiment that they were doing, was like the founding of Rome. All of those kind of talks and stuff. There was a revived interest in the classics, in the Renaissance masters. Thomas Jefferson was very interested in Italian architecture, Italian Renaissance architecture. The years preceding the American Revolution, the American War of Independence, was one of a very strong revived interest in the study of the Greek and the Roman classics and the Renaissance masters. There was a very huge interest in Michelangelo, Da Vinci, Giotto, and Florentine and Genovian, Florentine, and all sorts of these different Renaissance artists, Renaissance painters, and cultural figures. And the colonial American elite would emulate classical and Renaissance architecture. Take Thomas Jefferson's Montevideo, for example. Take Thomas Jefferson's Montecito in Virginia has a good example. It is the ideal Renaissance home. It is the ideal Renaissance home. It has the ideal 18th century cultural etiquette, and it has the ideal Renaissance man's homestead. Thomas Jefferson and Benjamin Franklin and many of the founders idealized themselves as Renaissance men. They idealized themselves as Renaissance gentlemen and gentlemen who engaged in Renaissance ethics, Renaissance thinking, and Renaissance and classical ideas and thought, as well as the ideas and the thought of their time in the Age of Reason. And there was a growing interest in the classics, in the Renaissance, in the Italian Renaissance, a growing interest in the Bible, and a tremendous just growing upsurge of an interest in this cultural, in this etiquette, in this courtly etiquette, in this gentlemanly Renaissance man, self-made Renaissance man etiquette and courtly order. This kind of Roman courtly order or Roman courtly civic orderliness that these founders engaged in. So, to my friend from Discord, that is what the founding fathers were thinking of. Thomas Jefferson was considering himself as an ideal Renaissance self-made man. So, the nepotism or the emphasis of engaging in the ideas of the Renaissance, in engaging even more so in that of the classics, had a very tremendous influence on the American Revolution. Now, I have read all sorts of different things, how the founding fathers were deists. The founding fathers were deists, and they were atheists. They did not believe in God. They wanted separation of church and state. They wanted to have religion restrained or even outright banned. A lot of them were deists, and they did not believe in a literal interpretation of the Bible. I have read things about how the founding fathers were devout Christians, that George Washington, every morning when he got up, would pray this 5-paragraph long prayer and give thanks unto the Almighty and all this stuff, and how they were all devout Christians. I have read all sorts of crap, but what I can tell you is that in 1775 and 1776, America was a very Christian country, regardless of the Age of Reason and all of that stuff. America was a very religious and very Christian country. There's no doubt about that. A lot of the founders probably were deists or deistic, or were engaging in deist ideas, and they generally separated themselves from the mainstream of society, and they didn't openly express their ideas too much in wider society or in polite society. They went to church, and they read their Bible, and they heard the sermons, and they gave to charities, but quietly, John Adams and other founding fathers just did not really care that much about religion. They did not have a fervency, and they did tend to not really take a literal interpretation of the Bible. and they just kind of looked at it as a moral guiding thing. It was kind of like a moral guide or a moral guide or a moral play or something, kind of like a Shakespeare play. Um, a lot of the founding fathers would have looked at the Bible as like a Shakespeare play. You know, it's an interesting guiding thing. It's a guide of morality, but it shouldn't be taken literally. The Bible, like a Shakespeare play, should not be taken literal, and it should not, always be utilized in a dominating manner to interpret your worldview. They were much more taken in by the Renaissance and by the classics than by the Bible, if to be honest, if you want to know how the founding fathers really thought. Now, in the early 19th century, there was another Great Awakening, and this second Great Awakening was very much more fervent, and it was less institutionally guided. It was less institutionally guided from top to bottom, and it was much more of a grassroots movement. The American Revolution severed America's ties from Europe. It severed America's ties from Protestant institutions in Europe, and it very much upscaled and generated a native Protestant American movement that engaged in corporeal revivalism and the likes. It is no small wonder that in the Second Great Awakening of the 1820s, the 1810s and 1820s, that all of the major modern denominations grew out of that. And we still have a lot of them. The American Methodist Church, American Presbyterianism, the Baptist Church, the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, and the Millerites that later became the Seventh-day Adventists and other Adventists, just to name a few. Most of the major and the largest Protestant sects came out of the Second Great Awakening, and it's just basically humble return to the Bible, humble return to justification by faith. There's a few caveats added as well. There's more of this pragmatist approach. If the First Great Awakening was more of a holiness and more of an institutionally based approach, the Second Great Awakening was more of a pragmatist approach to things. It was also much more actively engaging than the first one. There was talks and discussions about banning alcohol. There was talks about giving women the right to vote. The first movement about women's emancipation met in Seneca Falls, New York in 1846, 1847 in Seneca Falls, New York. That was the first major active discussion about women's emancipation. A lot of what later came into the progressive movement came also out of the Second Great Awakening. Anti-slavery, women's the temperance movement, ban on alcohol, women's emancipation, and wider voting franchise, and all sorts of other sort of more democratically engaging things. And so, if the First Great Awakening was more aligned with institution and was more seeking an active engagement with God, or seeking a greater advancement in engagement with God and sola scriptura, the Second Great Awakening was definitely a product of the American Revolution and a product of transcendentalism, of a 19th century transcendentalism, and it was definitely taking up the idea of democracy and of Christian moral democracy, and this idea of a moral guidance, of self-improvement, moral guidance, nuclear family orientation, homesteading, and just all of these other things that went into mainstream American ideas. Now, there was a Third Great Awakening that happened in the 1870s. The Third Great Awakening is where the Pentecostal movement came out of. Jehovah's Witnesses came out of it. The current form of a lot of Adventist movements came out of the Third Great Awakening. And this is where you get the pragmatistic, the holiness movements that later became the Pentecostals or the Pentecostal movement, and some of the Bible-based Baptist things. All of that stuff kind of started around the turn of the 20th century. There have also been other great awakenings that are not as well researched or as well written down and researched as the first former two. But overall, American society, a very fundamentally religious society. It has always been a very religious and very strongly devout country or nation, even at times when that could actually be fatalistically dangerous. Every successful politician, every successful businessman have always had to appeal to religion and to God, and to religion and personal vindication and personal conviction in order to sway the masses over to their ideas and over to their pulpit. So, anyways, it is no accident that in 1947, it is no accident that in about 1952, Dwight Eisenhower put on the American dollar, "In God We Trust." It is no accident that Dwight D. Eisenhower put "In God We Trust" on the US dollar. So, how is this approached from a didactic perspective? What is the dialectic of this fervently unwavering Protestant zeal in American history? What is the dialectic of this? The dialectic is the separation of church and state. But even though the separation of church and state, it is all the norm to seek active engagement of religion within civic institutions. It is all the norm of using religion to influence civic institutions and the drive and influence within civics. So that is the dialectic, that is the Hegelian dialectic of this approach to American Protestantism. The internal dialectic here is this drive for something, this striving or this drive for some kind of active engagement with God without necessarily really giving much in terms or giving away much in terms of an institutional description or an institutional explanation for that Protestant pragmatism. So the word here is Protestant pragmatism. You could also say Protestant fundamental or Protestant fundamentalism or Protestant evangelicalism. I wouldn't say that. I would say more of a Protestant pragmatism, a very pragmatistically Protestant interpretation and explanation for looking at the world. That is how Americans engage and do things, and that is very much an American thing. The Bible and the belief in God and these different types of Protestant sects are very much a very strong influence on Anglo-American life and the Anglo-American way of thinking. And the separation of church and state is absolutely taken for granted. And the way that Americans look at that is different from Europeans is Americans look at the separation of church and state as there not being a single national church, but instead hundreds and hundreds of separate Protestant denominations that each have their own say or their own equal say in what they want to have. This is very different from how the Europeans look at the separation of church and state. To them, there is a national church. There is one single church denomination that is the predominant denomination in that European country, every citizen of that European country is a member of that one denomination, whether it's Roman Catholic or Lutheran or Episcopalian or Anglican. And to them, the separation of church and state is that the government cannot talk about God. They cannot engage openly in any kind of discussion that is indifferent to non-religions or to different non-Christian religions or to atheists. That is perhaps the most profound difference of them all. And so the dialectic here is that when the first American colonist came to what would become the United States, or when the United States separated from Europe, Western Europe and Great Britain were still very Christian and very religious driven societies. And so the separation happened before that divergement. Whereas afterwards, Europeans became more and more indebted to secularism. They left their religions or their religious beliefs and they became more secularist. Whereas the Americans at their founding were much more influenced by humanistic Renaissance or humanist Renaissance principles, and over time, as America went further away from that founding, it became more religious. And it actually went in the opposite direction. It became more religious and more Christian-centric and more fervently and pragmatically Protestant, whereas the Protestant parts of Europe became less Protestant. They moved away from that civic kind of Protestantism, and they actually became less Protestant in that regard and more religiously pluralistic. Whereas in a strange and very almost bizarre way, America became more Protestant. It actually became even more Calvinist, more Lutheran, and more Anglican and Presbyterian, Methodist and Baptist than Switzerland or Holland or any of those, or Canada or Australia. And it's very weird how this happened. It's very interesting, but that is a story for another day. So the Hegelian dialectic, the natural rational dialectic in all of this, I think, is there is no one single way that Americans worship God. There is a common held set of beliefs or a very common but not the same set of principles in the worship of God in American mainstream society. But other than that very hollow and very simplistic line of thinking, Americans all disagree on what God is. Like Americans have their own different interpretations of Christ. There is a very strong Americanization of Jesus Christ in ways that even the Europeans would not be able to understand. And so there is a active engagement, but at the same time there is there's a cognitive dissidence in American Protestant Christianity. There is a very strong cognitive dissidence in American mainstream in regards to what exactly Christianity is. If you were to go to a university in Europe, if you were to go to a university in Paris or in England at Oxford, they would tell you all of the major tenets of what the Christian religion is, but they would not tell you how exactly it is best to worship or engage actively with Christ. If you were to go to a religious institution in America, they would not be able to tell you anything, not even the most base line of what the tenets of Christianity is, because they don't know it. They don't understand it. Most Americans don't understand the basic tenets of their own faith or even the basic principles of their own faith. But they do fundamentally believe it. And the average American, the American at that university, would be able to tell you how to actively seek out and engage and worship God in a practical manner. And so practicality and pragmatism, I think, is the word here that needs to be used when it comes to understanding the cognitive dissonance in regards to what exactly is an American creed on faith. What exactly is the American creed? And a lot of Americans will tell you that it is like freedom and God or freedom in Jesus Christ and stuff. And I think that Canadians, Aussies, New Zealanders, Europeans, and Brits have a lot of trouble understanding what that really means. Anyways, I am Imperator of Forge, otherwise known as Forge Warhammer, and this is my third case study in American history. This is the Faultlines in American history, case study number 3. American Protestantism Without Bounds. So Ghost of Niccolo or Ghost of Achilles is in chat. He is saying, Forge forever, hard men. How are you doing, Ghost of Achilles? Ghost of Achilles says the Forge dialect, it's dialectic, but thank you, sir. Beet Soup is in chat saying hard men. Ghost of Achilles says Forge gang goes with Christ. God is with Forge gang. And Ghost of Achilles says, based on. Ghost of Achilles has the crown and hammer emotes. All right, so I've been your host, Imperator of Forge. This has been the Faultlines in U.S. American History case study number 3. The unwavering designs of American Protestantism, or the the influences of unwavering and unappealing pragmatic Protestantism. Thank you so much for watching and have a good day. Forge Gang!